Sydney had to bring Serena back. She was her sister. Family isn't always blood. June had said that. June, who'd never betrayed Sydney. June, who'd protected Victor. But she wasn't Serena. And if Eon was chasing them now, Serena could help. Serena could do anything. Could make other people do anything. It was a terrifying power to start with. But how bad would it be if Serena came back wrong? What would that power look like when it was fractured? Broken? For so long, Sydney had assumed she was afraid of failing, afraid that she'd slip, lose the threads, and with that, her only chance at reviving Serena. But the longer she stared at her sister's bones, the more Sydney realized she was just as scared of succeeding. Why had she waited so long? Was it really because she thought it had to happen here? That the connection would be strongest back where it had first been broken? Or was it because it gave her an excuse to wait? Because Sydney was afraid to see her sister again? Because Sydney wasn't ready to face Serena? Because Sydney wasn't sure she should bring her sister back, even if she could? Tears blurred her vision. She realized suddenly that in all her nightmares, Serena had never once saved her. She was there, on the banks of the frozen river, waiting, watching as Eli stalked Sid across the ice, as he wrestled her to the frozen ground, as he wrapped his hands around Sid's throat. Serena hadn't pulled the trigger on Sydney that night, but she hadn't stopped Eli from shooting her either. Sydney missed her sister, but she missed the version of Serena who had loved and protected Sydney, made her younger sister feel safe and seen. And that Serena had died in ice, not fire. Sydney's fingers finally came to rest against Serena's bones, but she didn't reach beyond them, didn't search for the lingering thread. She simply folded them up inside the strip of cloth and put them back in the red metal tin. Her legs were shaking as she pushed herself up to her feet. Sid shoved the container deep into her pocket, heard the scrape of metal on metal as the tin came to rest against the gun. In her other pocket, her fingers found her cell phone. She dug it out as she left the Falcon Price lot and headed back toward the Kingsley. Watched it restart in her palm. Her boots dragged to a stop. There were so many missed calls. A handful from Victor, then a dozen from Mitch, and text after text after text from June. Sydney took off running. She tried to call Mitch, but it went straight to voicemail. Tried to call Victor, but no one answered. At last, June picked up. "Sydney." "What's going on?" she asked. "Where are you?" demanded June, sounding breathless. "I had all these missed calls," said Sid, slowing to a walk, "and I can't get a hold of anyone, and I—" "Where are you?" repeated June. "On my way to the Kingsley." "No," said June. "You can't go back there." "I have to. It's too late." Too late? What did she mean? "Just stay where you are, and I'll come to you." "Sydney, listen to me." "I'm sorry," said Sid, right before she hung up. It had taken her 25 minutes to walk to the Falcon Price. She made it home in 10. The Kingsley finally came into sight, down the block and across the street. Sid slammed to a stop as she noticed the two black vans idling on the corner, one near the entrance, the other at the mouth of the parking garage. They were unmarked, but there was something ominous about the tinted glass, the windowless sides. Arms wrapped around her shoulders. A hand closed over her mouth. Sydney twisted, tried to scream, but a familiar voice sounded in her ear. "Don't fight. It's me." The arms let go, and Sid turned to see June, or at least a version of her, one with loose brown curls and sharp green eyes. Sydney sagged in relief, but June's attention twitched, drawn to something over Sid's shoulder. "Come on," said June, gripping her hand. Sid resisted. "I can't just leave them." "You can't save them like this. What are you going to do, storm in there? Think. If you go in there now, you'll just get yourself caught by Eon. And what good will you be to anyone then?" June was right, and Sid hated that she was. Hated that her power wasn't enough to protect them. "We need a plan," said June. "So we'll think of one. I promise." She squeezed Sydney's hand. "Come on." This time, Sid let herself be pulled away. It was beginning to rain as Victor followed Stell through the streets of downtown Merritt. He plucked a black umbrella from a corner stand without paying and vanished beneath it, one bloom of darkness among dozens. Half a block ahead, the detective stopped beside a black van and a sedan and convened with a cluster of soldiers in sodden street clothes, their manner and posture nullifying any meaningful disguise. Victor lingered nearby, folding himself into the huddle at the bus stop. He watched Stell rake a hand through his salt and pepper hair, the picture of frustration. Watched him gesture at the soldiers who got back into their vehicles, while Stell himself set off on foot. Victor fell in step behind him. Stell walked for 10-15 minutes more before swiping into a residential building. Victor caught the front door just as the elevator closed. He watched it ascend 1 floor, then 2, before stopping. Victor took the stairs instead, and arrived just as Stell was unlocking the front door. Watched the man stiffen as he registered the other man's presence, realized that he wasn't alone. Stell turned, drawing his service weapon before he saw Victor, and froze. Victor smiled. "Hello, Detective." Stell's hand was steady on the gun. "It's been a while." "I'm surprised it took you so long." "In my defense," said Stell, "I assumed you were dead." "You know what they say about assuming," said Victor dryly. "We EOs are hard to keep down." He nodded at the weapon. "Speaking of down." Stell shook his head, grip tightening on the gun. "I can't do that." Victor flexed his hand. "Are you sure?" He splayed his fingers, and shock crossed Stell's face like lightning as his own hand opened, let the gun fall to the floor. "You're not the only one who's traded up," said Victor, moving toward the detective. The air caught audibly in Stell's throat as he tried to back away, and couldn't. "Pain is specific, but relatively simple," continued Victor. "Now animating a body, articulating it, that requires precision, the firing of certain nerves, the pulling of specific strings, like a marionette." "What do you want?" hissed Stell. "I want to stop dying," thought Victor. But Stell couldn't help with that. "I want you to keep Eli in his goddamn cage." Surprise crossed the detective's face. "That isn't your call." "How could you be so stupid?" growled Victor. "I do what I have to," said Stell. "And I certainly don't answer to." Victor's hand clenched into a fist, and Stell doubled over in pain. He caught himself against the wall, gave a sharp whistle through gritted teeth, and a second later, every other door in the hall swung open, soldiers streaming in, weapons raised. "I want him alive," ordered Stell. Careless, Victor chided himself. The cop had baited his own trap, and he had stepped inside. "You've always preferred being predator to prey," observed Stell. Victor's teeth clicked together. "Did Eli teach you that?" "Give me a little credit," said Stell. "You guys aren't the only ones who can spot a pattern." "What happens now?" asked Victor, trying to sense the number of bodies surrounding him. How much power would he have to use to level the ones he couldn't see? "Now," said Stell, "you come with us. This doesn't have to get violent," he continued. "Get on your knees and—" Victor didn't wait for him to finish. He reached out with everything he had. 2 bodies hit the floor behind him, another buckling at the edge of his sight. Then Stell shot Victor in the chest. He staggered, his hand going to his ribs. But there was no blood, only a red dart, buried deep. A vial, already empty. Whatever it held, it was strong. Victor wrenched the dart out, but his limbs were already going numb. He cranked the dial up on his own nerves, clung to the pain to regain focus. Victor brought 2 more soldiers to their knees before another shot pierced his side. A third took him in the leg, and he felt himself slip. He tried to brace himself against the wall, but his legs were already folding. His vision flickered, then dimmed. He saw the soldiers swarming in, and then nothing. Roman numeral 12. The last afternoon. Across town. 3 blocks from the Kingsley, June was making instant cocoa while Sydney perched on the edge of the nondescript hotel bed. Outside, it had started to rain. Sid tried Victor's phone again, but it was off now, just like Mitch's. She even tried Dominic's number, but there was no answer there either. June had told her everything. Eon's task force, their mission to catch Victor and Sydney. The simple fact that June had to choose quickly, knowing she only had time to reach one. She'd been so worried, and by the time she got to the Kingsley, the Eon soldiers were already there. Which meant that Mitch... June seemed to read Sid's mind. "The big guy can take care of himself," she said, carrying over 2 mugs. "And if he can't, what difference would you have made? No offense, Sid, but your power wouldn't protect him. It would only get you caught, and Mitch wouldn't have wanted that." She paused. "Drink up. You're shivering." Sydney wrapped her fingers around the hot mug. June sank into a nearby chair. It was so weird, seeing her again. Sid had had the other girl's voice in her ear for more than 3 years, the words on her phone. But she'd only seen June's face once before, and of course, it wasn't really hers. It wasn't even the one she was wearing now. Sydney took a long, scalding sip, cringing not at the heat, but the sugar. June had made it way too sweet. "What do you really look like?" she asked, blowing on the steam. June winked. "Sorry, kiddo. A girl's got to have some secrets." Sid looked down at the cocoa and shook her head. "What am I going to do now?" "We," said June, "are going to think of something. We'll get through this, you and me. We just have to lie low until it's over, and then—" "Until what is over?" demanded Sid. "I can't just stay here when Victor and Mitch are in trouble." June leaned forward, resting a hand on Sid's boot. "They're not the only ones who can protect you." "It's not about protection," said Sid, pulling away. "They're my family." June stiffened, but Sydney was already on her feet, abandoning the half-empty mug beside the bed. June could have grabbed her, but she didn't. She simply watched her go. Sydney was almost to the door, reaching for the handle, when it seemed to drift out of reach. The floor had tilted too, and suddenly, it was all Sid could do to keep from falling over. She squeezed her eyes shut, but that only made things worse. When Sydney opened them again, June was there, reaching out to steady her. "It's okay," she said, her accent soft, melodic. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Sid tried to ask what was going on, but her tongue felt leaden, and when she tried to pull away, she stumbled, head spinning. "You'll understand," June was saying. "When this is all over, you will." Sydney's vision blurred, and June's arms closed around her as she fell. The road jostled under Eli's feet as the transport made its way toward Merritt. 5 minutes into the drive, the hood had come off, trading the dark, woven interior of the fabric for the dark, windowless interior of the van itself. Not a vast improvement, but certainly a step. The brown-eyed soldier sat on the bench to Eli's right. The other two sat across from him. They rode in silence, Eli attempting to track the distance with one part of his mind, while the rest traced over the details of the plan he'd been given, pondered the problem of Marcella and her chosen compatriots. He felt Brown Eyes staring at him. "Something on your mind?" asked Eli. "I'm trying to figure out how a guy like you kills 39 people. Eli raised a brow. "You can't kill what's already dead. You can only dispose of it." "Does that apply to you too?" Eli considered. For so long, Eli had thought himself the exception, not the rule. Now he knew better. And yet Eli had been given this specific power. A memory flashed through his mind, kneeling on the floor, slicing open his wrists over and over and over to see how many times it would take before God let him die. "I would bury myself if I could." "Must be nice," said Green Eyes, "to be unkillable." A second memory, of lying on that lab table, his heart in Haverty's hands. Eli said nothing. A few minutes later, the van came to a stop on a busy street. Eli could hear the noise even before the back door swung open and Stell himself climbed in. "Briggs," he said, nodding at the woman. "Sampson, Holtz. Any trouble here?" "No, sir," they said in unison. "Where have you been?" demanded Eli. "Believe it or not," said Stell, "you weren't the highest priority." He'd meant it as a jab, but Eli saw only its truth, written in the lines of the director's face. Victor. The van drove on for a few more blocks before pulling into an alley, where the 3 soldiers climbed out, but not Stell. He turned his attention to Eli. "They are going ahead to secure the room. In a minute, you and I are going to leave this van and go inside. You make a scene, and that collar will be only the first of your problems." Eli held out his cuffed wrists. "If you want to keep a low profile, these should probably come off." Stell leaned forward, but simply tossed a coat over Eli's outstretched hands, hiding them from view. Eli sighed and followed the director out of the van. He looked up at the stretch of blue sky and breathed in fresh air for the first time in 5 years. Stell brought a hand to Eli's shoulder, kept it there as they wove through the cars in front of the hotel. "Remember your instructions," warned Stell as they stepped through the doors and crossed the lobby to the bank of elevators. The soldiers were waiting on the 5th floor. 2 in the hall, one still clearing the room. They'd taken off their helmets in an effort to blend in, revealing 3 young, good-looking soldiers. A woman in her early 30s, compact and strong and stoic. A young man, handsome and blonde, 30 at most, who looked like he would have won most likable while in school. A second man, wide-jawed and smug, who reminded Eli of the frat boys he'd hated in college, the kind who would crush a beer can on their heads as if the feat were something to be proud of. Once inside, Stell finally removed Eli's handcuffs. He rubbed his wrists. They weren't stiff or sore, but it was a hard habit to shake, that urge, and the small gestures that made people ordinary, human. Eli surveyed the room. It was an elegant hotel suite with a large bed and 2 tall windows. A garment bag hung on the back of the bathroom door. Another had been cast onto the bed. A chair sat beneath one of the large windows, a low desk beneath the other, its surface adorned with a pad of paper and a pen. Eli started toward it. "Stay away from the windows, inmate." Eli ignored him, resting his hand on the desk. "We're here because of this window." His fingers closed around the pen. "This view." He leaned across the desk and looked out at the old courthouse across the street. What a perfect choice, thought Eli. After all, a courthouse was a place of judgment. Justice. He straightened, slipping the pen up his sleeve, and started for the bathroom. "Where do you think you're going?" demanded Green Eyes. "To take a shower," said Eli. "I need to be presentable." The soldiers looked to Stell, who stared at Eli for a long moment before nodding. "Sweep it," he ordered. Eli waited while the soldiers secured the bathroom, making sure there was no way out, removing anything that might be even vaguely construed as a weapon, as if Eli himself weren't the weapon of choice today. When the soldiers were satisfied, he unhooked the garment bag from the bathroom door and stepped inside. He was pulling it shut when one of the soldiers caught the door. "Leave it open." "Suit yourself," said Eli. He left a foot of clearance for modesty, hung up the borrowed suit, and turned on the water. With his back to the open door, Eli freed the stolen pen from the cuff of his Eon-issued jacket and held it between his teeth as he stripped off the clothes, let them pool around his feet. He stepped into the shower, the frosted glass door falling shut behind him. He ran his fingers over the surface of the steel collar, searching for a weakness, a groove or clasp, but he found none. Eli hissed in annoyance. The collar, then, would have to wait. He removed the stolen pen from his mouth, and under the static of the water's spray, snapped it in 2. It was hardly ideal, but it was the closest thing to a knife he was likely to get. Eli closed his eyes and summoned the pages from the black folder. He'd studied them thoroughly, memorized the photos and scans that had accompanied each of Haverty's experiments. The recording had been gruesome, but revealing. The first time Eli had noticed the shadow on an image of his forearm, he'd taken it for a swatch, just one of those markers used to signal direction on an X-ray. But then it showed up again on an MRI. A small metal rectangle, the faint impression of a grid. And he knew exactly what it was. Eli found the same mark on a scan of his lower spine, at his left hip, the base of his skull, between his ribs. Disgust had welled like blood, as Eli realized every time Haverty had cut or pried or pinned him open, the doctor had left a tracking device behind, each one small enough so that Eli's body, instead of rejecting the objects, simply healed around them. It was time they came out. Eli brought his makeshift scalpel to his forearm and pressed down. The skin split, blood rising instantly along the jagged edge. And an old voice in his head noted that the heat and moisture would act as anticoagulants, before he reminded that voice that his healing power rendered the fact irrelevant. He clenched his teeth as he drove the plastic deeper. Haverty had never bothered with shallow wounds. When he opened Eli up, he did it down to the bone. The static of the spray would have provided a buffer, but Eli didn't make a sound. Still, as his fingers slipped and slid and blood ran down the drain, Eli felt a tremor of residual panic pass through him. The only kind of mark left by Haverty's work. Invisible, but insidious. At last the tracker came free, a sliver of dark metal clutched between stained fingers. Eli set it in the soap dish with a shaky breath. 1 down, 4 to go. The Kingsley. Mitch rolled over and spit a mouthful of blood onto the hardwood floor. One eye was swelling shut, and he couldn't breathe through his broken nose. But he was alive. He could move. He could think. For now, that would have to be enough. The apartment was empty. The soldiers were gone. They'd left Mitch behind. Human. That one word, a judgment, a sentence, had saved his life. The Eon soldiers lacked either the time or the energy to deal with someone so tangential to their pursuit. Mitch forced himself to his hands and knees with a groan. He had a muddled memory of movement, grasping at consciousness as the soldiers spoke. "We've got him." It took a long time for the words to sink into Mitch's bruised skull. Victor. He got haltingly to his feet and looked around, taking in the trashed apartment, the blood-stained floor, the dog lying on the floor nearby. "Sorry, boy," he murmured, wishing he could do more for Doll. But only Sidney could have helped him now, and Mitch had no idea where she was. He stood there, amid the carnage, torn between the need to wait for her and the need to go find Victor, and for a second, the two forces seemed to pull him physically, painfully apart. But Mitch couldn't do both, and he knew it, so he asked himself, what would Victor do? What would Sid? And when the answers were the same, he knew. Mitch had to leave. The question was where to go. The soldiers had taken his laptop, and he had crushed his primary cell, but Mitch crouched, which turned out to hurt just as much as standing up, and felt under the lip of the sofa, dislodging the small black box and the burner smartphone that it was feeding into. His butler. In the old black-and-white movies he'd always loved, a good butler was neither seen nor heard, not until they were needed. And yet they were always there, tucked innocently into the background, and always seemed to know the comings and goings of the house. The concept behind Mitch's device was the same. He booted the phone and watched as the data from the soldiers' electronic tracking streamed in. Calls, texts, locations. 3 phones, and they were all in one place. Got you. All his life, people had underestimated Mitch. They took one look at his size, his bulk, his tattooed arms and shaved head, and made a snap judgment. Slow, stupid, useless. Eon had underestimated him too. Mitch looked around, found the playing card Sidney had left behind. He scribbled a quick instruction on the back, and rested the playing card on the dog's motionless side. "Sorry, boy," he said again. And then Mitch grabbed his coat and his keys and went to save Victor. Roman numeral 13. The last afternoon. Eon. Victor opened his eyes and saw only himself staring back. His lean limbs, sallow skin, black clothes, reflected in the polished ceiling. He was lying on a narrow cot against the wall of a square space, quickly discernible as some type of cell. Panic slid like a needle beneath Victor's skin. 4 years he'd spent in a place like this. No, not quite like this, not as clever, not as advanced, but just as empty. He had been buried alive in that solitary confinement cell, and every day Victor had sworn that once he got out he would never let himself be trapped again. He brought a hand to his chest and felt the bruise between his ribs where the first dart had gone in, scraping bone. He sat up, paused for a moment to let the lingering nausea pass, then stood. There was no clock in here, no way to tell how long he'd been unconscious, aside from the constant hum of his power, its strength and volume growing with each passing minute. Victor looked around and resisted the urge to call out, unnerved by the idea that no one would answer, that the only response he'd be greeted by was his own echo. Instead, he studied the surroundings. The walls, which he'd originally taken for rock, were actually plastic or maybe fiberglass. He could feel a subtle charge coursing through it, a deterrent, no doubt, against escape. He looked up, scanning the ceiling for cameras, and was interrupted by a familiar voice filling the cell. "Mr. Vale," said Stell. "We've come a long way, only to find ourselves back where we started. The difference, of course, is that this time you won't be getting out." "I wouldn't be so sure of that," said Victor, forcing his voice to hold its edge. "But I have to admit, this isn't exactly sporting." "That's because this isn't a game. You're a murderer, and an escaped convict, and this is a prison." "What happened to my trial?" "You forfeited it." "And Eli?" "He serves another purpose." "He's playing you," sneered Victor, "and by the time you figure out how, it will be too late." Stell didn't rise to the bait, leaving Victor in silence. He was running out of patience and out of time. He looked up at the cameras. He may be in a cage, but Victor had prepared for the possibility. He had left himself a key. The question was, where was Dominic Rusher? Dom tugged at the steel standard-issue handcuffs, but they were bolted to the table. 3 years, and his only fear had been waking up in an Eon cell. Instead, he'd woken up in an interrogation room. He was sitting in a metal chair, cuffed to a steel table, and he was alone. The only door clearly locked, the control panel on the wall marked by a solid red line. Panic flickered through him, and Dom had to remind himself that they didn't know he was an EO. Not yet, and he needed to keep it that way, as long as possible. Dom was truly trapped. He could slip out of time, but it wouldn't do a damn bit of good because even without time, he would still be chained to a fucking table. And he'd be even more screwed because the moment he crossed back into reality, the slip would show, the gap between where he'd been and where he was. Maybe it would just look like a stutter, a shudder, a glitch, but there were no glitches in a place like Eon, and everyone watching him on camera would know what it meant, what he was. So Dom waited, counting time in his head, wondering where Eli was now, hoping Victor at least had gotten away. Finally, the keypad turned from red to green. The door unsealed, and 2 soldiers came in. Dom had been hoping for a friendly face, but instead he got Rios again, joined by a hard-edged, brutish soldier named Hancock. Dom's attention hung on the sliver of shrinking freedom as the door behind Rios swung shut, and the codes went red again. Shit. Rios crossed to the table and set down a file. Dom's file. He scanned the tops of the pages, searching for paperclips, staples, anything he might be able to use.
"Agent Rusher," said Rios, "you want to tell us what you were doing in the director's office?"
Dom had put his short time awake to good use. He was ready for this line of questioning. "I was trying to stop a murderer from escaping." Rios raised a brow.
"How do you figure that?"
Dom sat forward. "Do you know about Eli Ever? Or Elliot Cardale, or whatever name he wants to go by? Do you know what he did?"
"I've read his file," she said, "and I've read yours."
"Then you know I was one of his targets. I still don't know why, but I should be dead. Would have been, too, if Eli had gotten to me. So when I heard that Stell planned to have him transported off-site, I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't have that maniac loose in Merritt again."
"That wasn't your call, soldier."
"So fire me," said Dom.
"That's not my call," said Rios. "You'll be held here until the director returns to make a decision."
Rios was shuffling the file as she spoke, and Dom caught sight of a metal staple just before Hancock's comm went off. The low static muffled the words, but one of them leapt out. Vale. Dom tried to hide the recognition on his face as Hancock lifted the comm to his ear. Vale. Awake.
"In the meantime," continued Rios, "I suggest—"
"How did you get into Stell's office?" asked Dom, changing directions. She looked up, a shadow crossing her face. Dom pressed on. "There's only one door, and I was facing it. But you showed up behind me." Rios's eyes narrowed.
"Hancock," she said, "go call Stell. Ask him what he wants us to do next."
Dominic really did want to hear Rios's explanation, but not as much as he needed to get out. He waited as Hancock swiped his keycard, waited as the line turned green, and the door clicked open.
"Now, Agent Rusher," she continued, "let's
He didn't give her a chance to finish. Dominic took a deep breath, like a swimmer before a dive, and jerked backward, the world parting around him as he slipped out of time and into the shadows. The room hung in perfect stillness, a painting in shades of gray, Rios frozen, her face unreadable, Hancock halfway through the door, Dominic still handcuffed to the table. He rose, pulling the stapled pages toward him, and got to work prying the bit of metal loose. He worked the sliver free, then straightened it out, and began fitting the slim bar between the teeth of the handcuff and the locking mechanism. It took several tries, the weight of the shadows like wet wool draped across his limbs, and a red welt rising on Dominic's wrist from the constant applied pressure. But finally the lock came loose. He pried the handcuff open, repeated the same grueling process with the other side, and was free. Dom fastened the cuffs back around Rios's wrists, then ducked under Hancock's frozen arm into the hall. The air dragged around him like an ocean tide as he approached the nearest control room. There was only one other soldier there, a female agent named Linfield, sitting in front of a console and frozen mid-stretch. Dominic freed the cattle prod from her holster and brought it to the base of her neck before stepping back into the flow of time. A flash of blue-white light, the crackle of current, and Linfield slumped forward. Dom pushed her chair aside and started searching, hands flying across the keyboard. He didn't have long. Every second Dom stood in the real world was a second exposed, a second he could be caught, captured. A second alarms were going up, and soldiers were invariably crashing toward him. And yet, despite it all, the world narrowed as he typed, his heart racing, but the pulse strong, steady. He'd always been good under pressure. Dom didn't have time to figure out which cell Victor was being kept in, so he chose the fastest option. He opened them all. 1 minute, Victor had been pacing the confines of his silent, empty cell, and the next, the world was plunged into motion and sound. An alarm, high and bright, wailed as the farthest wall of the cell dropped away, the solid pane of fiberglass retracting into the floor. Lights flashed white overhead, but instead of going into lockdown, the facility seemed to be opening, coming apart. To every side, Victor heard the metal crank of seals breaking, doors unlocking. About time. He stepped out of the cell, only to find himself in a second, larger chamber, this one cast in concrete instead of plastic. It was roughly the size of a small airplane hangar. He circled until he found a door. It swung open, under Victor's touch, and gave way onto a white hall. He made it 3 steps before whatever Dominic had managed to cause was suddenly reversed. Doors slammed, locks sealed, alarms cut off and then started again, the lights no longer white, but a deep arterial red, like a twisted game of Simon Says. But Victor didn't stop moving. Not when a hail of distant gunfire echoed in a nearby hall. Not when boots sounded on slicked linoleum. Not when plumes of white gas began to pour through the overhead vents. A barrier slammed across the hall in front of him, and so Victor doubled back, holding his breath as he swung around a corner, found himself face to face with 2 Eon soldiers, helmeted and armed. He lunged for their nerves as their weapons flew up, but Victor was too late. Their fingers reached the triggers an instant before his power could reach them. The shots rang out, a burst of gunfire, and Victor lunged sideways, but the hall was narrow, and there was no escape. A bullet, not a tranquilizer this time, but slim, piercing steel, grazed his side right before his power knocked the hands and the guns off course. But Victor's own hold faltered too, and in that stolen second, the guns adjusted, retrained on his head, his heart. The soldiers fired, the hall filling with the sharp retorts, and Victor braced for the impact. It never came. Instead, an arm wrapped around his shoulders. Dominic's body twisting in front of Victor like a shield as he pulled them both back into the dark. The world went suddenly, perfectly still. They were standing in the same place, in the same hallway, but all the violence and urgency had been sucked out of the space, replaced by silence and calm. The advancing soldiers hovered, frozen in time, the bullets carving lines of motion as they hung suspended in the air. Victor dragged in a few steadying breaths, but when he tried to speak, nothing came out. The shadows were a void, swallowing not only color and light, but also sound. Dominic's face was a grim mask, a foot from Victor's own, as the soldier's hand tightened on his sleeve, and he tipped his head in a wordless command. "Follow me." Roman numeral 14. The last evening. First in white. Once again, Marcella had chosen to wear gold. She'd come a long way since that pivotal night on the National's roof, shedding not only her husband but the scalloped decadence of that first dress, trading it for the polished sheen of white gold silk. It molded to her body like liquid metal, rising up around her throat and plunging down between her shoulder blades, pooling in the small of her back. To my beautiful wife. In a certain light, the milky fabric seemed a second skin, the soft shimmer brushed onto bare flesh, turning her to gold. What's the point of having beautiful things if you don't put them on display? Marcella tucked a coil of black hair behind one ear, admiring the liquid way the gold earring fell from the lobe. A bracelet circled one wrist. Her nails, painted to match. If beauty were a crime. A net of white gold beads, like a band of stars, over her hair. Does she come with a warning label? Her heels, thin as blades, and just as sharp. My wife, the business major. The only drops of color, the steady blue of her eyes and the vivid, vicious red of her lips. You don't want to make a scene. Her hand drifted to the mirror. I always thought you were a brazen bitch. The glass silvered under Marcella's touch, burning black in spots, as if it were film, erosion spreading until it swallowed the gold dress and the blue eyes and the red lips set in a perfect smile. Jonathan was leaning against the wall, fidgeting with his gun, ejecting and reinserting the magazine the way Marcus used to punch the end of his pen when he was restless. Click, 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 click.
"Stop that," she ordered, turning toward him. "How do I look?"
Jonathan gave her a long, considering stare. "Dangerous." Marcella smiled.
"Come zip me up."
He slid the gun back into its holster. "Your dress has no zipper." She gestured at the heels. He came forward and knelt, and she lifted one foot onto his waiting knee.
"No matter what happens tonight,"
she said, tipping up his chin,
"keep your eyes on me."
Sydney woke up in an empty bathtub. She was curled on her side, wrapped in a large comforter in the deep white basin, and for a second she had no idea where she was. And then haltingly, she remembered. The Kingsley, June, the hotel, and the cup of too sweet chocolate. Sydney got to her feet, head pounding from whatever June had put in the drink, and grateful she hadn't drunk more of it. She stumbled out of the tub and tried the bathroom door, but the handle only turned a couple inches. Sid knocked, and then pounded, threw her shoulder into the door and felt the resistance, not of a lock, but an object found against the other side. Sid turned, surveying the small windowless room, and saw the note sitting on the sink. "I'll explain everything when this is over. Just trust me. Jay." She felt herself tremble, not with fear, but anger. Trust? June had drugged her, locked her in a hotel bathroom. She'd thought that June was different, that she saw Sydney as a friend, a sister, an equal. But for all that talk of trust, of independence, of letting Sydney make her own choices, June had still done this. Sid had to get out of here. Had to find Victor, and save Mitch. She felt for her phone, only to remember she'd left it on the coffee table. But as she dug her hands into her bomber jacket, she felt the small metal tin with Serena's bones in one pocket, and the cool steel of the gun in the other. June obviously hadn't thought to frisk her. After everything, she'd treated Sydney like a naive child. Sid drew out the gun, fingers flexing on the grip as she aimed at the doorknob, then reconsidered, shifted the barrel toward the hinges on the other side. The shot echoed, deafening, against the tile and marble, hard surfaces reflecting it back at an ear-splitting level. Sydney fired twice more, then threw her weight into the door again, felt the hinges break, the wood swing free, and she was out. Roman numeral 15. The last evening. Eon. The white halls stretched in a strange tableau. Soldiers kneeling at corners, and frozen mid-stride in halls. A woman on fire, the flames licking at the soldiers trying to approach. A man on his knees on the ground, arms being wrenched behind him. Clouds of gas lit by the red strobe of the emergency lights. And weaving through the scenes, Victor and Dom making their way out of Eon. It was slow, agonizingly slow, the air dragging like water at their arms and legs, and Victor holding Dom's sleeve like a blind man. And in some ways, he was blind. Blind to the path through the maze. And then Dominic dropped. There was no warning, not even a stumble. He simply sank to the floor. Victor knelt too. It was that or let go, but as Dom's back came to rest against the wall, Victor saw the front of his uniform, black on black, but shining wet. The bullets had torn tidy, coin-sized holes. The shootout in the hall. In that brief instant, when Dom had surged out of the shadows and before he'd pulled them back. "You fool," muttered Victor, soundlessly. He pressed his hand against the wound, felt the shirt soaked through with blood. How Dominic had stayed on his feet so long, Victor didn't know. Dom shuddered, as if cold, so Victor severed his nerves and said, "Get up." But Dominic couldn't hear him. "Get up," he mouthed again. This time Dominic tried, rose a couple of inches, only to slip back to the floor. His mouth moved, the words lost, but Victor understood. "Sorry." "Sorry," said the ex-soldier, and Victor realized that he could hear Dominic's voice this time. The shadows were crumbling around them, color and life sweeping in through the cracks. Victor tensed, tightened his hold on Dominic's arm. But it wasn't his grip that was slipping. It was Dom's. "Hold on," ordered Victor, but Dom's head lolled to the side, and the colorless, soundless space between time collapsed back into chaos and noise, gas and gunfire. Blood slicked Victor's palms, streaked the floor, stretched behind them in a vivid breadcrumb trail, shockingly red against the sterile white surfaces. Victor started to draw Dominic to his feet, but the ex-soldier was dead weight now, his skin gray, waxy, his eyes open, but unseeing. Victor let go, easing the body back against the wall as soldiers barreled around the corner. This time, Victor moved first. No hesitation, no calculation, just blunt and brutal force. He dropped them like stones in deep water. Victor stepped over their limp bodies. The facility's front doors came into sight, one long, empty hall standing between him and freedom. And then a soldier stepped through the wall in front of him. There was no sliding door, no hidden hall. She came straight out of the wall, as if it were an open door. She stood before him, unmasked, dark eyes sharp, and a cattle prod hanging from one hand. An EO, working for Eon. Victor didn't have time to be surprised. The soldier lunged for him, blue light crackling across the top of the baton. Victor leapt backward, reaching for her nerves, but before he could get a grip on them, she cut sideways, vanished again through the wall. An instant later, she was behind him. Victor spun, catching her wrist just before the electric baton found bare skin. "You're troublesome," he said, the words swallowed up by the wailing alarms. He wrenched her nerves, and the soldier gasped in pain, but didn't crumple. Instead, she slammed her boot into Victor's wounded side. He went down hard on the white floor, and she was on top of him, or would have been, if his hand hadn't shot out at the last second, dragging her body to a stop. The soldier fought his hold, even as he forced her hand to turn the cattle prod back on herself. Her eyes narrowed in concentration as her will warred with his. But Eli was loose, and Sidney was lost, and those two things made Victor immovable. He flexed one hand, drove it toward his chest, and in a mirror motion, the soldier drove the cattle prod into her own. Blue light, the crackle of energy, and the EO collapsed, unconscious. Victor rose, swept around her body to the wide glass doors. But they didn't open. There was no escape. Mitch didn't know what to do. His car idled 100 feet beyond the high metal gates of the Eon complex as the rain turned from a drizzle to a downpour. He sat behind the wheel, now jury-rigging the butler's small black box to hack the gate's frequency instead of tracking signals. That would get him closer to the building, but it still didn't answer the problem of how he was going to get in, or rather, how he was going to get Victor out, or even where to start looking for him. There was a guard in a security booth inside the gate, and who knew how many officers inside the building, and it would take a hell of a lot more than a smartphone and a hacking fob to crack the security around a place like Eon, which meant, if Victor was getting in, he'd have to use force. He was still racking his brain for the best of several bad plans, when the rain eased a little, enough for Mitch to make out the building's front doors, and the distinctive figure standing just beyond them. Victor. Mitch hit the button on the black box, and the gates to Eon began to slide open. He gunned the engine and shifted into drive, tires skidding in the rain before lurching forward through the gate, and straight toward Eon. Victor leapt out of the way just before Mitch crashed his car through the front doors. The glass, reinforced as it was, didn't shatter, but it did buckle, bow, and as Mitch reversed the car, Victor was able to pry the doors open and slip through. He threw himself into the front seat. Mitch's foot was already on the gas. The guard from the security tower was running toward them, but Victor flicked his hand, as if the guard were only a bug, a nuisance, and the other man collapsed. Mitch's car, its front end a mess of crumpled metal, barreled through the open gate and drove away. He checked the rearview mirror. Nobody was behind them. Not yet. He glanced sideways at Victor. "That's a lot of blood." "Most of it is Dominic's," replied Victor grimly. Confusion washed over Mitch. He didn't want to ask, didn't really need to. The only answer that mattered was in Victor's eyes, as they avoided his. "Where's Sidney?" he asked. "I don't know." "You drop me off," said Victor, "and you find her, and then you get the hell out of this city." "Drop you off where?" Victor pulled the invitation from his back pocket. It was crumpled and blood-stained, but the gold lettering on the front was clear. The old courthouse. Roman numeral 16. The last evening. Downtown Merritt. The rain was finally easing by the time Marcella stepped outside. 3 cars sat idling on the curb ahead, one elegant black town car flanked by 2 SUVs. The security detail swept around them, 4 men in crisp black suits, raised umbrellas masking them from sight. Marcella wasn't taking any chances. Stell would be getting desperate, and desperate men did reckless things. They reached the sedan, and Jonathan held open her door. When he wasn't wallowing, he could be quite a gentleman. Marcella slid into the back seat and noticed she wasn't alone. A man sat across from her, tan and elegant in a pale gray suit. He was staring out the window and sulking profoundly.
"Well," asked Marcella, "did you get to her in time?"
The man nodded and spoke in that familiar lilt. "It was a near thing," said June, "but I did."
"Good," said Marcella briskly. "You'll bring her to me, of course, when this is done."
June's borrowed eyes flicked sideways, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Of course." Jonathan climbed in on the other side. Marcella had no trouble seeing June behind her many faces, but Jonathan jumped a little at the sight of a stranger. "Johnny boy," cooed June, "rest easy now. The prodigal EO has returned to the fold." Marcella considered June.
"Is that what you're wearing?"
The man's mouth tugged into a wry smile. "Am I too pretty?" And just like that, he vanished. Smooth, high cheekbones replaced by a bag lady with a crooked nose.
"Is this better?"
Marcella rolled her eyes, glad to see June restored to her usual humor.
"Surely," she said, "there's a happy medium."
June gave a dramatic sigh and dissolved into a middle-aged man with a groomed mustache and an attractive, if mildly forgettable face. "Better?"
"Much,"
said Marcella. June gave her a sweeping look. "You look like Snow White killed the queen and stole the mirror." Marcella flashed a cool smile.
"I'll take that as a compliment."
June settled back in her seat. "You would." Eli smoothed his hair back and buttoned his shirt. He dumped the fragments of the broken pen into the toilet tank. The tracking devices he slipped into the pocket of his suit jacket. It felt good to be back in real-world clothes, even if they were on the formal side. He'd donned 100 different costumes in the service of his work. All he was missing was a weapon, a knife, a length of wire. But he could make do with his bare hands. He'd certainly done it before. Eli was just knotting the borrowed tie when he heard the commotion beyond the bathroom door, the radio chatter mixing with Stell's gruff voice. Eli undid the knot and started again, working slowly as he listened. "No. God damn it. Who was it? No. We continue as planned." Eli waited until it was obvious there was nothing more to glean, then emerged, taking in the scene. Stell's cheeks were ruddy. He had never had much of a poker face, and only one man could cause so much consternation. Victor.
"Everything okay?"
asked Eli. "Just focus on the task," ordered Stell, pulling on his own suit jacket and running a hand through salt and pepper hair. More salt by the day, thought Eli. Some people really weren't suited for this line of work. He wasn't the only one who'd gotten dressed. The woman now wore a silk black jumpsuit, the kind that belonged on a catwalk, not a field agent. The young blonde was still in his uniform, but the square-jawed soldier wore a black jacket over a crisp white shirt open at the throat. Eli hummed thoughtfully.
"The invitation only admits 2.
In answer, Stell produced a second card.
"A replica?"
wondered Eli aloud. If it was a copy, it was flawless. "No," said Stell. "It's the one Marcella sent to the district attorney. Lucky for us, he's out of town." He handed the spare invitation to the female soldier. "Holtz," he said, nodding at the blonde. "We'll stay outside." "Always the short straw," muttered the soldier. Stell checked his watch. "It's time." The black van was gone when Sydney got back to the Kingsley. She found the apartment door broken, ajar, and she drew her gun, clutching it in both hands as she stepped through. The first thing Sid saw was blood. Fat drops of it, leading down the hall. Then a small pool on the hardwood floor smeared by the edge of a handprint. And the body. Doll. Sid scrambled to the dog's side, sinking to her knees beside his still form. She knocked the playing card from atop his chest, ran her fingers through his fur, closed her eyes, and reached, felt the thread of the dog's life dancing away, dodging her grip. Every time it was harder. Every time she had to reach deeper. As Sydney worked, a terrible aching cold wound through her, and she felt her lungs seize, her breath trip, and then at last she caught the thread, dragging Doll back to life. Again. The dog's chest heaved, and Sid sank back, gasping for air. Her attention drifted to the King of Spades, now overturned, a note in Mitch's tight script on the back. Went to find Victor. Sid got to her feet, and so did Doll, shaking off his death as if it were rain. He pressed himself against her side as if to ask, what now? Sid looked around. She didn't have a phone. Didn't have a clue where anyone had gone. But she did have something, the invisible tether that ran between her and the thing she brought back. Sydney didn't know if it would be enough, but she had to try. She closed her eyes and reached for another thread, felt it go taut against her fingers. "Come on," she said to Doll, stepping around the blood. When they reached the street, Sid paused, closing her eyes again, felt her world tip ever so slightly to the left, as if to say, this way. She started walking. "Drive faster," said Victor, trying to ignore the buzzing in his skull, those first warnings of a building charge. It would wait. It had to wait. "Why?" demanded Mitch, even as he sped toward Merritt. "Why are we going toward this mess instead of away?" Victor found a roll of paper towels in the back seat and pressed them to the shallow wound along his ribs. "Eli will be there." "All the more reason to go the other way. You two can circle each other forever, but there's only one way it ends, Victor, and it's not in your favor." "Thanks for the confidence," said Victor dryly. Mitch shook his head. "You and your vengeance." But it wasn't vengeance. Whatever's happened to you, however you're hurt, you've done it to yourself. Campbell had been right. Victor had to take responsibility. For himself, and for the monster he'd helped to create. Eli. "You're going in like that?" Mitch was asking. Victor turned the card over in his hand. "I have an invitation." But he looked down at himself. Mitch had a point. He'd lost his favorite trench coat somewhere between the confrontation in Stell's hallway and waking up in the cell. A thin slice ran along his black t-shirt. He'd done his best to rinse the blood from his hands with a bottle of water, but it was still under his nails. He had no weapons, and no plan. Only the knowledge, the certainty, that Eli would run, the first chance he got, and Victor would be there to stop him. Roman numeral 17. The last night. The old courthouse. Eli stepped through the doors into the grand foyer, wicking rain from his hair. The venue was already brimming with people, men and women in evening attire. The toast of merit, it seemed, all in one place. The two soldiers had already entered, several people ahead, and had immediately dissolved into the crowd. Eli and Stell advanced, and were stopped by a pair of security guards with handheld metal detectors. "Law enforcement," said Stell brusquely, displaying his sidearm. "Sorry, sir," said the guard. "This is a weapons-free event." The irony, thought Eli, spreading his arms as the baton drifted over him. Not so much as a beep. Stell reluctantly surrendered his gun. They passed a coat check station, and Eli shrugged out of his jacket and handed it to the clerk, watching the tracking devices drift away. That still left the problem of the collar. But between stepping out of the shower and into the suit, Eli had come up with a plan. They stepped into the courthouse's grand atrium, a circular chamber surrounded by pillars and topped by a dome. Eli craned his head, admiring the building. It was a showpiece of classic architecture, high-ceilinged and hollow, equal parts elegant and austere. Wrought iron sconces bloomed like metal bouquets on each of the pillars, broad silver dishes, an echo of the scales in Justice's hand, sat atop polished marble tables that seemed to rise straight out of the floor. A viewing balcony ran along the base of the dome, looking down on the atrium below, and in the atrium's center, on a marble stand, a bronze statue of Justice herself rose toward the ceiling, nearly 2 stories tall. There was no sign of Marcella, not yet, but that didn't surprise Eli. She would make an entrance, that much he could predict. Jonathan, he guessed, wouldn't be far from her side, and June would be impossible to spot, at least until she made a move. Eli spotted the 2 Eon soldiers, carving their slow security sweeps through the thickening crowd. The hall echoed with laughter, the light low, the air dancing with champagne flutes and jewelry and bodies clustering close. Bystanders, moving pieces, distractions. Stell was at his shoulder. "When the time comes," said Eli, "will you be able to get the bystanders out?" "I'll do my best," said Stell. "Getting their attention might be difficult." Eli scanned the space, thinking. The windows were high and narrow, useless, the crowd thick, but that could work in their favor. Panic was contagious. Like dominoes, all you had to do was fell the first one.
I'll be right back.
Stell caught his shoulder.
Where are you going?
To get you a gun.
Eli nodded at Marcella's security, all dressed in trim black suits.
Haven't you noticed? The guests may not be allowed to carry, but her men certainly are.
Stell didn't let go.
At some point,
said Eli calmly,
you have to let out my leash.
The director stared at him for a long, hard moment, and then his hand finally fell away. Eli turned and slipped through the crowd, trailing one of the security guards as they split off down a hall toward the bathroom. Eli followed him in, watched the guard vanish into a stall, waited for another man at the sink to finish washing up, and leave. Eli slid the bolt in the man's wake and approached the stall door. It swung open, and Eli slammed his shoe into the guard's chest, sent him reeling back into the wall. Eli caught him by the tie before he could fall, drew the guard's holstered gun, and pressed it tight to his chest to muffle the shots. Eli eased the body back onto the seat. It had been a long time since he killed a human, but forgiveness would have to wait. He returned to Stell's side and presented the director with the stolen gun, low and easy, as if it were a handshake among friends. Stell looked at him with bald surprise. They both knew that Eli was the one holding the weapon, Eli the one with his finger near the trigger. But he spun the weapon in his hand, offering Stell the grip instead of the barrel. After a pause, Stell took the gun, and Eli turned and plucked a champagne flute from a passing tray. He might as well enjoy the party.
Last call for second thoughts, murmured June. Or second call for last ones.
Rain drummed on the roof of the town car as it pulled up outside the old courthouse.
Don't be somber,
said Marcella.
It's a party.
It's madness, countered June. Marcella's lips twitched.
Good thing there's method in it.
It was a gamble, of course. A risk. An ambitious play. But she used to tell Marcus the world wasn't made for the faint of heart. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And if Marcella's plan went up in flames, well, she'd take the whole damn city with her. As she stepped out of the car, the broad umbrellas appeared again, ushering her to the waiting bronze doors of the old courthouse. From inside, Marcella could hear the clink of ice in crystal glasses, the murmur and melody of an eager crowd. She brought her hand to the polished metal, splayed her fingers across the surface, gold nails gleaming, as June and Jonathan took their places behind her. Marcella smiled.
Showtime.
Mitch's car screeched to a stop in front of the old courthouse. Pain lanced through Victor's side as he got out, but he didn't dare turn it down, not with the episode building in his bones.
Victor,
started Mitch. He glanced back. Remember what I said. Find Sid, and leave. Victor climbed the short stone steps, pushed open the bronze doors, his free hand wrapped as casually as possible across his ribs. He handed his invitation to the suit at security, who hesitated at the blood flecking the cream paper. He looked at Victor, who stared coldly back, leaning on the man's nerves as he did until the discomfort registered on his face. The security waved him through. Victor headed for the atrium, doubling back at the sight of the coat check. His eyes trailed over the jackets and shawls that had already been checked in, landing on a black wool trench on the left, with a high collar and black leather trim. Victor flagged the clerk. I lost my ticket, he said, but I'm here to claim my coat. He nodded at the trench. The kid, and he really was just a kid, wavered. I'm sorry. I can't return a coat without a valid claim. Victor forced the kid's mouth shut, watched his eyes widen in surprise, confusion, horror as he pinned him still. I can break your bones without lifting a finger, he said smoothly. Would you like me to show you? The kid's nostrils flared in panic as he shook his head. Victor released his hold, and the clerk stumbled back, gasping, fingers trembling as he pulled the trench from the rack. He shrugged on the coat. He felt in the pockets and found a 20. Thanks, he said, tucking the cash into the short glass jar. The atrium was crowded, full of bodies and noise. Victor made a slow circle of the chamber, hugging the outer edge as he wove between guests, scanning the crowd. And then across the hall, through the crowd, a familiar face. One that hadn't changed in 15 years. Eli. For a moment the gala seemed to fade into the background, the details and sounds retreating until only the singular man stood in sharp detail. Victor didn't realize his feet had begun to move until a hand pulled him back, dragged him sideways behind the nearest marble pillar. Victor was already reaching for the assailant's nerves when he saw the familiar tattoos spiraling up the man's broad arm. "I told you to drive," said Victor. But then he noticed a sly gleam in Mitch's eyes, the strange set of his mouth, that familiar lilt present beneath Mitch's casual hello. "June."
Get off me, ordered Victor.
June didn't let go.
You have to stop her.
"I'm not here for Marcella."
You should be, said June. She's got her sights on Sydney.
"Because of you."
No,
protested June.
I never told her. But she knows, and now she wants her. And from what I've seen, Marcella.
As if on cue, the crowd parted, and a gold figure ascended the stone dais in the center of the room. Victor pulled free of June, looking to where Eli had been, but the man was gone. Shit. He scanned the crowd, searching the sea of dark suits until he caught movement. Most of the men and women were standing still, their attention transfixed on Marcella's ascent. Eli slid through them like a shark, his own focus just as clear. Victor mirrored Eli's progress, the two of them cutting matching lines toward the dais, and the statue, and the woman in gold. And then, at last, Eli noticed him. Those cold, dark eyes slid past Marcella and landed on Victor. Surprise flickered across Eli's face and then sank away, replaced by a grim smile as the barrel of a gun came up against the base of Victor's spine, and Stell's gruff voice sounded in his ear.
That's far enough, Mr. Vale.
Marcella had spent her life on display, but tonight she finally felt seen. Every pair of eyes was focused on her as she took the dais. Every pair curious and bright and waiting for the reveal, because they knew there was more. More than beauty, more than charm. Whether they knew it or not, they'd come to see power. When Marcella spoke, her voice carried, buoyed by the marble hall and the stillness of the crowd, their faces upturned like flowers hungry for the light. "I'm so glad," she said, "that you could join me tonight." As she spoke, Marcella made a slow circle around the dais, savoring her hold on the gathered audience, the most powerful people in Merit, or so they thought. "I know the invitation was a touch enigmatic, but I promise you, the best things are worth the wait, and what I have to offer you is better shown than told." June took the stairs two at a time. She'd shed Mitch's bulky frame for a slimmer one, and with the added quickness to her steps, she loped up to the balcony that overlooked the atrium with its sea of people. At their center, Marcella was making a slow circle around the base of the statue. June found Jonathan tucked in a shadow, watching the show. He rested his elbows on the wrought iron rail, all his focus on Marcella's luminous form. "Some of you have money," Marcella's voice rang out, "and some of you have influence. Some of you were born with power, and others built it from nothing. But you are all here because you are impressive. You are lawyers, journalists, executives, law enforcement. You lead this city. You shape it. You protect it." "Do you see that man?" said June, pointing to the pale blonde head moving through the crowd. "Victor Vale," said Jonathan blandly. "Yeah." If Victor wouldn't help her willingly, June would force his hand. He was a creature of self-preservation. They all were. "If he gets too close to Marcella," she said, "shoot him." Jonathan drew his handgun from the holster under his suit jacket, his eyes never drifting from Marcella. "Don't kill him," added June. "Not unless you have to. She doesn't want him dead." Jonathan shrugged. His complacence had always annoyed her, but for once June was glad he didn't ask questions. "Thanks, Johnny boy," she said, slipping back down the stairs. Stell. Victor gritted his teeth as, across the gallery, Eli continued his slow, methodical approach to the dais, where Marcella still held court. "You understand the importance of power," she was saying. "What you don't yet understand is that those ideas of power are outdated." Stell dug the gun into Victor's back.
I'm not letting you get in the way.
"Is that so?" Victor scanned the crowd. "That is why I'm here," continued Marcella. "To open your eyes." Eli was almost to the dais as her hand drifted up, coming to rest on the statue's bronze robes. "To show you what real power—" Victor chose a man at random and twisted his nerves. A scream split the air, and for an instant Marcella's voice was washed out, the crowd's interest diverted. And that same instant, Victor rounded, slamming his elbow back into the side of Stell's head. Stell's gun went off, but Victor was already out of the bullet's path, moving determinedly toward the platform, and Marcella. And Eli. At the sound of the firearm discharging, the tense crowd had shattered into panic. The guests surged away, a wave of bodies frantically pushing toward the exit. Only Victor and Eli still moved inward, toward the center of the room, and the golden figure on her stand. Victor was almost there when another gunshot went off, the ground sparking as the bullet struck the marble a foot away. He looked up and saw Jonathan up on the balcony, recognized the EO's intent just in time to see him line up a second shot. The bullet tore through Victor's shoulder, the pain hot and white, blood welling instantly. He swore, reaching for Jonathan's nerves before the man could fire a third time. Victor caught them, turned the dial, as he had in the art gallery, and just like in the art gallery, the blue-white light of Jonathan's force field flared up, instantly shielding him. Victor felt his hold slipping, but this time he didn't let go. Every object had a shatter point, a limitation to its tensile strength. Apply enough force, and it would break. Roman numeral 18. The last night. The old courthouse. For 5 years, Victor Vale had lived in Eli's head, first as a ghost, then as a phantom. But both, Eli realized now, had been critically flawed, a version of his rival that had been trapped in amber, unchanging, like him. The real Victor showed every one of the last 5 years, and then some, worn thin. He looked sick, just as Eli had suspected. No matter. He would make things right. But first, Marcella. She was stepping down from the statue, her face contorted not with fear but with fury as she headed straight for Eli.
"Are you behind this interruption?" "Apologies," he said. "I was just so eager to meet you." "You'll regret that," Marcella sneered, stepping within range. Eli reached to grab her, but that blue-white light flashed up between them, forcing his hand away, rebuffing him, but not her. Marcella stepped into the circle of his arms and brought her fingers to his cheek. "You really should have run with the rest of them," she said, hand flaring red. Pain lashed across Eli's face, a wave of agony as his skin dissolved, exposing teeth, jaw. But even as the rot spread, he could feel it reversing, the muscle and skin healing. The amusement melted from Marcella's eyes and mouth, replaced by surprise, shock. "Why would I run?" said Eli, his cheek knitting back together. "I'm here to kill you." Marcella pulled back, suddenly uncertain. He had missed that. The expression on their faces before they died, the way the scales trembled and shook before they fell into balance, as if the EO knew that they were wrong, that their lives, what they took for lives, were stolen, that it was time to let go. A gunshot went off nearby, and then another, and seconds later the air above flared blue and white, crackling with energy. Victor stood, head craned, and when Eli followed his gaze, he saw Jonathan at the heart of the storm. Victor spread his hands, and the air surged, the EO above swallowed from sight. The surprise on Marcella's face cracked, showed fear. Eli had a theory. He decided to test it. With Jonathan preoccupied, Eli reached out and wrapped a hand around Marcella's throat. There was no light around her this time, no force field shock, only soft white skin under his fingers. Marcella's hands flew up, digging into Eli's arms, the sleeves of his suit quickly crumbling. The skin beneath peeled back, then healed, then peeled away again. But Eli didn't let go. Across the gallery, Stell and his soldiers were trying to clear the panicked crowd, while on the other side of the statue, Victor continued to unleash his own power on Jonathan, as if the other EO were only a circuit, something to overload and interrupt. To think that, in a way, the two of them were working together again, like old times. Or like they could have been, perhaps. It was almost poetic, thought Eli, just before he saw an Eon soldier appear behind Victor. "No!" shouted Eli. But either no one heard him, or they didn't care. The soldier reached Victor and wrapped an arm around his throat, hauling him backward and breaking his focus. The blue-white light of Jonathan's force field vanished, and then reappeared an instant later, this time protectively thrown around Marcella. There was a noise, like thunder, a violent crack, and then Eli was thrown backward. Pain tore through his back as he struck the nearest pillar, hitting several feet off the ground. But Eli didn't fall. He looked down and saw one of the sconce's metal limbs jutting from his chest. Eli gritted his teeth as he struggled to push himself forward, pry his body off the iron bar. Marcella started toward him, rubbing her throat. "You must be Eli Ever," she said hoarsely. The great EO executioner. I have to admit, she said, putting her hand against his stomach. I'm underwhelmed. Marcella pushed Eli back down the bar, iron scraping his insides as his back hit the pillar. He let out a snarl. You don't seem to be healing, said Marcella, holding up a stained palm. Still planning to kill me? Yes, hissed Eli, blood leaking between his teeth. Marcella clicked her tongue. Men. She dug her nails into his injured stomach. Pain flared through Eli, as layers of skin and muscle peeled away, and organs shriveled, and he began to die. Eli's strangled scream cut through the marble hall, as Victor was forced to the floor.
Can't hurt what you can't see,
said the Eon soldier at his back, which wasn't strictly true, especially when they were foolish enough to have put their arm around his throat. The soldier cried out, as if his arm had been broken. No doubt it felt that way. As soon as the limb slackened around Victor's throat, he swung up to his feet and turned on the soldier, felling the man with the short flick of a now expert hand. The soldier slumped, unconscious, to the marble, and Victor turned his attention back to Eli, pinned against a metal fixture, a few feet off the ground. Shots echoed through the courthouse. Stell seemed to have figured out that Jonathan's particular ability required a line of sight, and was now emptying his own gun at the EO up on the balcony above. Blue-white light flared, but then Stell's gun clicked, the magazine already empty, and Jonathan retaliated, unleashing a hail of his own bullets, forcing both Victor and Stell to dive behind adjacent pillars. Victor was genuinely torn. If he took down Jonathan, Eli might be able to kill Marcella. If he didn't, Marcella might actually kill Eli, a death Victor longed for, and one he still wanted for himself. In the end, Victor's decision was made for him, not by Eli or Marcella, but by June. June, who appeared before him, once again wearing Mitch, and put a gun to the big man's head.
I asked nicely, but you didn't listen.
June brought her finger to the trigger.
Kill Marcella, she ordered, or lose him.
Everything about June, from the steady hand to the even gaze, told Victor that she would shoot Mitch, simply to make a point, let alone get what she wanted. When this is over, said Victor, you and I are going to have words. And with that he rounded the pillar, already reaching for Jonathan's nerves. The shield flared up anew, blue and white and defiant, and sweat beaded on Victor's skin. He'd never unloaded this much charge into one person, and his own nerves crackled and hummed from the sheer effort, threatening to short out once and for all. But at last, the force field began to splinter. Eli's vision swam as Marcella's hand clawed deeper, but he still saw the burst of light on the balcony behind her. Eli's lips moved, as if in pleading, and when Marcella leaned closer, he slammed his head into hers as hard as he could. Without Jonathan's protection, the blow landed, and Marcella staggered back, holding her cheek. She spun and saw Jonathan's own crackling shield. She started across the room toward Victor, leaving Eli pinned to the pillar. The wrought iron bar still jutted from his front, though Marcella had half ruined it, along with his stomach. Eli slammed his fist down into the rusted metal, and it crumbled away. He got his foot up against the pillar behind him and pushed himself off the lower remains of the bar, dropping to the floor. Eli's stomach was a ruin of blood and gore, but without the wrought iron driven through it, the wound was already healing. Organs closing, tissue knitting back into clean, smooth flesh. A deafening crack cut through the courthouse as Jonathan's force field finally shattered. The EO toppled forward over the banister and fell, hitting the floor below with the dull thud of dead weight on stone. Victor swayed and then sank to one knee, gasping from the effort. He didn't see Marcella moving toward him, her stride quickening as her hands began to glow. Eli reached her first, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, pinning her back against him. "Honestly," she snarled, "take a hint." Her power flared fast and hot, and Eli's world went white with pain as she pitted her strength against his. Back in the lab, Haverty had measured Eli's rate of recovery. The speed with which he healed, had marveled at the way it never slowed, like a battery that couldn't run down. But none of Haverty's tests had strained Eli's body the way that Marcella's power did now. She tipped her head back against his shoulder. "Are you having fun yet?" The air itself rippled with the strength of her will. Marcella's power was no longer coming from her hands alone. It radiated around them both, warping the nearest table, sending hairline cracks across the thinning marble at their feet. It ate away his suit and her dress, melting, ruining, erasing everything, until they stood in a shallow pool of ash atop the weakening floor. Eli's arms, caught in a constant transformation from skin to muscle to bone and back, pressed against Marcella's bare chest. "If you're counting on my modesty," said Eli, "you should know. I have very little left." Eli pressed himself against her, head bowed in a strange, almost loving embrace, as at last the steel collar around his throat rusted, fell away. Eli smiled through the agony. His final chains gone. The ground beneath him was wearing visibly now. Eli tightened his grip, his body screaming in protest. "I've killed 50 EOs, he hissed. "And you're nowhere near the strongest." Marcella's power wicked through the air. The bronze statue a dozen feet away began to rust, crumble. The pillars swayed, unsteady, and the whole building trembled, brittle, the marble beneath their feet wearing away, the same way Eli's body did, layer by layer. The marble thinned like melting ice beneath him, first translucent, then transparent. "It appears," said Marcella, "that we are evenly matched." "No," said Eli, as the floor splintered, cracked. "You can still die." Eli slammed his foot down into the fragile marble, and it shattered beneath him. Victor was halfway to his feet, one hand clutching his wounded shoulder, when the floor gave way. He staggered backward, boots searching for solid ground as the force of the crash rippled through the building. Only once he was beyond the wave of destruction did Victor see the full scope of what had happened. It was like a blast turned inward, an implosion. 1 second Eli and Marcella were tangled together, engulfed in light at the center of the atrium, and the next they were gone, plunging like meteors through the marble floor. The force of the collapse set off a chain reaction. The walls shook, the pillars toppled, the glass dome cracked and shattered. The hole was vast, a drop of 20, maybe 30 feet onto solid stone floor. There was no sign of June, but Victor saw Stell nearby, unconscious, 1 foot pinned beneath a broken pillar. The building stopped shaking. Victor stepped to the edge of the hole and looked down. Marcella lay stretched at the bottom of the chasm, her limbs draped over broken stone, her black hair loose and her head tilted at a wrong angle. Rubble shifted, and Eli staggered to his feet beside her, naked and bloody, his broken bones knitting themselves back together as he rose. He looked down at Marcella's body, and crossed himself, and then he craned his head and looked up through the broken floor. His eyes met Victor's, and for a second neither man moved. Run, thought Victor, and he could see the response in Eli's coiled frame. Chase me. A rock came free near Eli's bare foot, skittering down the pile of rubble, and both surged into motion. Eli spun, climbing over the wreckage, as Victor turned, searching for another way down. The nearest stairs had collapsed, the elevator was unresponsive. He finally found a stairwell, and took the steps 2 and 3 and 4 at a time, lunging down to the lower level, to the wreckage and the remains of Marcella Morgan. But by the time Victor got there, Eli was already gone. Roman numeral 19. The last night. The old courthouse. The building was a ruin, the tangle of stone still shifting and settling as Eli climbed out of the wreckage. Dust and glass rained down around him as he pried open a door, found a back stairwell intact, and climbed. The door at the top opened onto a parking garage. Sirens wailed nearby as he strode naked across the concrete toward the side street. It had been hard to walk away from Victor. There would be time for him again. But first, Eli needed to put distance between himself and the courthouse, and Eon's reach. "Excuse me, sir," called a security guard, approaching. "You can't—" Eli slammed his fist into the man's jaw. The guard dropped like a stone, and Eli stripped him, tugging on the stolen uniform as he stepped around the arm of the parking barrier and out into the alley. It had been 5 years since Eli's arrest, longer still since the last time he needed to disappear. Amazing how quickly the mind went down old paths. Eli felt calm, in control, his thoughts ticking off with soothing linearity. Now he just needed to— Pain lanced his side. Eli winced, and looked down to see a dart jutting between his ribs. He pulled the dart free and held it up to the light, squinting at the dregs of an electric blue liquid in the vial. A strange shiver ran through him, a tightness in his chest. Footsteps sounded behind him, slow and steady, and Eli turned around, only to find a ghost. A monster. A devil in a white lab coat, deep-set eyes peering out from behind round glasses. Dr. Haverty. Eli's mouth went dry. He flashed back to steel tables slick with blood, felt hands inside his open chest. But despite the bile rising in his throat, Eli forced himself to hold his ground. "All our time together," he said, tossing the dart away. "And you really thought something like that would work?" Haverty cocked his head, glasses shining. "Let's find out." The doctor swung the gun up and fired a second dart into Eli's chest. Eli looked down, expecting to see the neon liquid, but the contents of this vial were clear. He plucked out the dart. "I don't sleep," he said, tossing it away. "But I still dream, and I've so often dreamed of killing you." He started toward Haverty, but halfway there his front knee buckled, folded, as if it had gone to sleep. The world rocked sideways, and Eli collapsed to his hands and knees in the street, limbs suddenly sluggish, head spinning. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He was on his back now, Dr. Haverty kneeling beside him, measuring his pulse. Eli tried to pull free, but his body didn't listen. And then, for the first time in 13 years, Eli Ever passed out. Victor surged out up the stairs and out into the parking garage, the steel door crashing behind him. His shoulder was still bleeding, leaving a veritable breadcrumb trail on the concrete. On top of that, the humming had spread to his limbs, the tone pitching to a whine inside his head. He was running out of time. He scanned the garage. Would Eli take a car or set off on foot? There were no empty spaces, not here on the street level, and the odds of Eli wasting precious seconds on higher floors was slim. On foot, then. He started toward the exit and saw the security guard slumped on the ground, his body propped up against the booth. He'd been stripped to shorts and socks. Victor stepped past him and out onto the side street. There were too many alleys, too many ways for Eli to go, and every time Victor chose wrong, it would only increase Eli's lead. Something shimmered on the ground nearby, and Victor knelt to retrieve it. A tranquilizer dart. He looked up and noted a pair of security cameras mounted high overhead. He felt in the pockets of the stolen coat and was relieved to find a cell phone. He dialed Mitch's number, hoping for once the man hadn't obeyed his orders. It rang 2 times, 3, and then Mitch picked up.
"The courthouse is coming down. What the hell's going on?"
"Where are you?" asked Victor. A moment's hesitation.
"About 2 blocks away."
He was relieved to hear it.
"I still haven't gotten a hold of Sid."
"Well, since you're still here," said Victor, looking up at the security cameras, "I need you to hack something." Stell ground his teeth as Holtz and Briggs helped pry his leg free from the wreckage. He'd broken something, he knew, but he'd gotten lucky. Samson's body was buried somewhere at the bottom of the wreckage, swallowed up along with more than half of the courthouse floor. The rest of the building didn't look very stable. "Another ambulance is on its way," said Briggs over the noise of the approaching sirens. Holtz had kept the crowds at bay, done everything he could to minimize civilian exposure during the incident. But now emergency crews were rapidly arriving, and the crowd outside was too curious, too used to getting their way, demanding answers, explanations, casualty reports. Stell's mind spun, but he only had a few minutes to contain the scene here. Marcella Morgan's body lay draped atop the broken marble far below, a testament to her own destructive power. Heaped at the farthest edge of the ruined floor was the second EO, Jonathan, one hand hanging like a rag doll over the chasm's edge. There was no sign of June, or Victor, or Eli.
"Pull up the trackers."
"I already did," said Briggs grimly. She offered Stell Eli's coat in one hand. In the other, she held out 5 small tracking devices. Stell's stomach dropped. "It gets worse," said Holtz, producing the rusted remains of Eli's collar, broken, useless. Stell swept the shards from Holtz's hand, and they rained down onto the ruined floor.
"Call in everyone we have," he ordered, "and find Cardale."
Roman numeral 20. The last night. Location uncertain. The first thing Eli noticed was the smell, the antiseptic odor of a lab, but beneath that something sickly sweet, like rot or chloroform. His other senses caught up, registered a too bright light. Dull steel. His head was cotton, his thoughts syrup. Eli didn't remember what it felt like to be drunk. It had been so long since anything affected him. but he thought it must have been more pleasant. This, the dry-mouthed, head-pounding longing to retch, was not. He tried to sit up. Couldn't. He was lying on a plastic sheet on top of a crate, his wrists zip-tied to the wood slats beneath. A strap ran across his mouth, holding his head down against the crate. Eli's fingers felt for something, anything, found only plastic.
"Not as fancy as my old lab, I know,"
said Haverty, swimming into focus.
"But it will have to do. Needs must and all."
The doctor dipped out of Eli's sight, but never stopped talking.
"I still have friends in Eon, you know. And when they told me you were being released, well, I don't know if you believe in fate, Mr. Cardale."
He heard tools being shifted on a metal tray.
"But surely you can see the poetry in our reunion. You are, after all, the reason for my breakthrough. It's only right that you're now going to be my first true test subject."
Haverty reappeared, holding a syringe in Eli's line of sight. That same electric blue liquid danced inside.
"This," he said, "is, as you might have guessed, a power suppressant."
Haverty brought the blade to Eli's chest and pressed down. The skin parted, blood welled, but as Haverty withdrew the knife, Eli kept bleeding. The pain continued too, a dull throb, until slowly Eli felt the wound drag itself back together.
"Ah, I see,"
mused Haverty.
"I erred on the side of a low dose, to start. I gave the last subject too much too fast, and he just kind of came apart. But see, that's why you're the perfect candidate for this kind of trial."
Haverty took up the syringe.
"You always have been."
He plunged the needle into Eli's neck. It hurt, like cold water racing through his veins. But the strangest thing wasn't the sensation of pain. It was the spark of memory. A bathtub filled with cracking ice, pale fingers trailing through the frigid water, music on the radio, Victor Vale leaning against the sink. "You ready?"
"Now,"
said Haverty, dragging Eli back to the present.
"Let us try again."
Roman numeral 21. The last night. Warehouse district. Victor paused outside the bland gray building. It was a storage facility. A 2-story grid of climate-controlled, room-sized lockers where people abandoned furniture or art or boxes of old clothes. This was as far as Mitch's camera work had gotten Victor, but it was far enough. There had been another man, according to Mitch, glasses and a white coat. Eli dragged behind him, unconscious. Those words made no sense. The night of Eli's transformation, Victor had watched as Eli tried to drink himself into oblivion. But the liquor didn't even touch him. After his death, nothing could. Victor made his way through the ground-floor grid, scanning the roll-up doors for one without a lock. His shoulder had stopped bleeding, but it still ached. He didn't dampen the pain, needed every sense firing, especially with the charge building in his limbs, threatening to spill over. Victor heard a male voice, one he didn't recognize, coming from a storage container on his left. He knelt, fingers curling around the base of the steel door, as the voice carried on in a casual, conversational way. He inched the door up 1 foot, 2, holding his breath as he braced for an inevitable rattle or clank. But the voice beyond didn't stop talking, didn't even seem to notice. Victor ducked under the rolling door and straightened. Instantly he was hit by a stench, slightly noxious and far too sweet. Chemical. But he soon forgot the smell as he registered the scene before him. A tray of hospital-grade tools, a man in a white coat, his back to Victor, and his gloves slick with blood as he leaned over a makeshift table. And there, strapped to the surface, Eli. Blood spilled down his sides from a dozen shallow wounds. He wasn't healing. Victor cleared his throat. The doctor didn't jump, didn't seem at all surprised by Victor's arrival. He simply set the scalpel down and turned, revealing a thin face, deep-set eyes behind round glasses.
"You must be Mr. Vale."
"And who the hell are you?"
"My name," said the man, "is Dr. Haverty. Come in, take a—"
Victor's hand closed into a fist. The doctor should have buckled, dropped to the floor, screaming. He should have at least staggered, gasped in pain. But he didn't do any of those things. The doctor simply smiled.
Seat,
he finished. Victor didn't understand. Was the man another type of EO, someone whose own powers rendered him untouchable? But no, Victor had been able to feel June's nerves, even if he'd had no effect on them. This was different. When he reached for the doctor's body, Victor felt nothing. He couldn't sense the man's nerves. And suddenly Victor realized he couldn't sense his own either. Even the building episode, the terrible energy ready to spill over moments before, was now gone. His body felt like a body. Dull weight, clumsy muscle, nothing more.
That would be the gas, explained the doctor.
Remarkable, isn't it?
It's not technically a gas, of course, just a compressed airborne version of the power suppressant serum I'm currently testing on Mr. Cardale.
Victor registered motion over the doctor's shoulder, but he kept his focus on Haverty. Had the doctor himself turned around, he would have noticed Eli's fingers reaching out, feeling for the edge of the table, would have seen them find the scalpel Haverty had so foolishly set down. But Haverty's attention hung on Victor, and so he failed to notice Eli slipping free.
I've read your file, the doctor continued. Heard all about your fascinating power. I'd love to witness it myself, but as you can see, I'm in the middle of another.
Haverty turned to gesture then, finally, at Eli on the table. But Eli was no longer there. He was on his feet now, scalpel flashing in the fluorescent light. Eli struck, the knife parting the air, and the doctor's throat. Haverty staggered back, clutching at his neck, but Eli had always had a deft hand. The scalpel bit swift and deep, severing jugular and windpipe, and the doctor sank to his knees, mouth opening and closing like a fish as blood pooled on the concrete beneath him. He never stopped talking, said Eli curtly. Victor was very aware of the knife in Eli's hands, the absence of any weapon in his own. His eyes went to the tray of tools, more scalpels, a bone saw, a clamp. Eli put a shoe up on Haverty's back and pushed the doctor's body over. That man can burn in hell. His dark eyes drifted up. Victor, a pause. You were supposed to stay dead. It didn't take. A grim smile crossed Eli's face. I have to say, you don't look well. His fingers tightened on the scalpel. But don't worry. I'll put you out of your... Victor lunged for the tray of instruments, but Eli knocked it sideways. Tools scattered across the floor, but before Victor could reach any of them, Eli caught him around the middle, and they went down hard, Eli's scalpel driving down toward Victor's injured shoulder. He knocked Eli's arm off course at the last instant, and the blade scraped against concrete, drawing sparks. With Eli unable to heal and Victor unable to hurt, they were finally on equal ground, which wasn't equal at all. Eli was still built like a 22-year-old quarterback. Victor was a gaunt 35, and dying. In the blink of an eye, Eli had forced his elbow up against Victor's throat, and Victor had to throw all his strength into keeping one arm from stabbing him and the other from crushing his windpipe. It always comes down to this, doesn't it? Said Eli. To us. To what we did. Victor drove a knee up into Eli's wounded stomach, and Eli reeled, rolling sideways. Victor staggered to his feet, shoes slipping in Haverty's blood. He caught up one of the fallen instruments, a long, thin knife, and Eli lunged at him again. Victor dodged back half a step and kicked out Eli's knee. His scalpel-holding hand hit the ground for balance, and Victor brought his boot down, pinning hand and blade both to the floor as he swung his own knife toward Eli's chest. But Eli got his arm up just in time, and the knife sank into his wrist, blade driving deep and through. Victor let out a guttural scream, but when he tried to pull free, Eli caught his hand in a vice grip and twisted. Victor lost his balance and went down. Eli on top of him, the blade now in his grip. He brought it down, and Victor threw his hands up and caught Eli's wrists, the blood-slicked knife suspended between them. Eli loomed over him, leaning his weight on the blade. Victor's arms trembled from the effort, but little by little, he lost ground, until the tip of the knife parted the skin of his throat. Every end may be a new beginning, but every beginning had to end. Eli Ever understood that, leaning over his old friend. Victor Vale, weary, bleeding, broken, belonged in the ground. It was a mercy to put him there. My time will come, he said, as the knife point sliced Victor's skin. But yours is now. And this time, he said, I'll make sure you... A sound tore through the steel room, sudden and deafening. Eli's grip faltered as pain, molten hot, tore through his back, through skin and muscle in something deeper. Victor still lay beneath him, gasping, but alive, and Eli went to finish what he'd started, but the knife hung from his fingers. He couldn't feel it. Couldn't feel anything but the pain in his chest. He looked down and saw a broad red stain blossoming across his skin. His breath hitched, copper filling his mouth, and then he was back on the floor of a darkened apartment at Lockland, sitting in a pool of blood, carving lines into his arms and asking God to tell him why, to take the power when he didn't need it anymore. Now, as he looked up from the hole in his chest, he saw the girl, her white blonde hair and ice blue eyes, so familiar, beyond the barrel of the gun. Serena? But then Eli was falling. He never hit the ground. Roman numeral 22. The last night. Safe. Sydney stood at the mouth of the storage locker, still gripping the gun. Dahl whined behind her, pacing nervously, but Sydney kept the weapon trained on Eli, waiting for him to get back up, to turn on her, to shake his head at her weapon, her futile attempt to stop him. Eli didn't rise, but Victor did. He struggled to his feet, one hand to the shallow wound at his throat as he said, "He's dead." The word seemed wrong, impossible. Victor didn't seem to believe them, and neither could Sydney. Eli was forever. An immortal ghost, a monster who would follow Sydney through every nightmare every year, plaguing her until there was no one left to hide behind, nowhere left to run. Eli Ever wouldn't die. Couldn't die. But there he was on the ground, lifeless. She fired 2 more shots into his back just to be sure, and then Victor was there, guiding the gun from her white-knuckled grip, repeating himself in a slow, steady voice. "He's dead." Sydney dragged her eyes away from Eli's body and studied Victor. The ribbon of blood running from his throat, the hole in his shoulder, the arm he'd wrapped around his ribs.
"You're hurt."
"I am," said Victor, "but I'm alive." Car doors slammed nearby and Victor tensed. "Eon," he muttered, putting himself in front of Sydney as footsteps pounded down the hall. But Dahl only watched and waited, and when the door rose the rest of the way, it wasn't soldiers, but Mitch. He paled as he took in the storage locker, the makeshift operating table, the bodies on the floor, Victor's injuries, and the gun in Sydney's hand. "Eon's not far behind me," he said. "We have to go. Now." Sydney started forward, but Victor didn't follow. She pulled on his arm, felt instantly guilty when she saw the pain cross his face, and realized how much of the blood in here must be his.
"Can you walk?"
she pleaded. "You go ahead," he said tightly.
"No,"
said Sydney.
"we're not splitting up."
Victor turned and, cringing, knelt in front of her. "There's something I have to do." Sydney was already shaking her head, but Victor reached out and put a hand on her cheek, the gesture so strange, so gentle, it stopped her cold. "Sid," he said, "look at me." She met his eyes, those eyes that after everything still felt like family, like safety, like home. "I have to do this, but I'll meet you as soon as I'm done."
"Where?"
"Where I first found you." The location was burned into Sid's memory, the stretch of interstate outside the city, the sign that read Merritt, 23 miles. "I'll meet you at midnight."
"Do you promise?"
Victor held her gaze. "I promise." Sydney knew he was lying. She always knew when he was lying. And she also knew she couldn't stop him. Wouldn't stop him. So she nodded and followed Mitch out. Victor didn't have much time. He waited until Mitch and Sid were out of sight, and then returned to the storage unit. He fought to focus as he dragged his aching limbs across the room, stepping around Eli's body. It was like a magnet, constantly drawing his eye, but Victor forced himself not to stop and look at it, not to think about what it meant, that Eli Cardale was really, truly dead. The way the knowledge knocked Victor off balance, a counterweight finally removed. An opposite but equal force erased. Instead, Victor turned his attention to Haverty's tools and got to work. Exodus. Roman numeral 1. After. Stell's apartment. Victor ran his fingers over the surface of his phone, 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight, and he was not on his way out of town. Victor settled back into the worn armchair, tuning the dials of his own nerves to test their strength. Haverty's serum had worn off a few hours before. It had been like a limb returning to feeling, nerves initially pins and needles sharp, before finally settling back under control. But as Victor's power returned, so had the humming in his head, the crackle of static. The beginnings of another episode. But only the beginnings. That was the strange thing. Before stepping into the storage locker, his limbs had been buzzing, the current minutes from overtaking him. When Haverty's serum suppressed his power, it had suppressed the episode too. Reset something, deep inside Victor's nervous system. He drew a vial from his coat pocket, one of 6 that he'd collected from Haverty's storage locker. Its contents were an electric blue, even in the darkness of the empty apartment. The liquid represented an extreme solution, but it also represented progress. He'd have to be mindful. Each time Victor used the serum, he would be trading a death for a window of vulnerability, a period without powers. But he was already making notes, plans, really. Perhaps with the right dosage, he could find a balance. And perhaps was more than Victor had had to work with in a very long time. His phone lit up. He had switched it to silent, but it still flashed brightly, a familiar number on the screen. Sydney. Victor didn't answer. He watched the screen until it gave way again to darkness, then slipped the phone in his pocket as footsteps sounded beyond the door. A few seconds later, the rattle of a key in the lock, and Stell limped into view, one foot encased in a medical boot. He tossed his keys into a bowl, didn't bother turning on the lights, just hobbled to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. The director of Eon had the liquor halfway to his lips when he finally realized he wasn't alone. He set the drink back down. Victor. To his credit, Stell didn't hesitate. Simply drew a gun and aimed it at Victor's head, or at least he meant to. But Victor stilled the man's hand. Stell grimaced, fighting the invisible weight around his fingers. But it was a battle of wills, and Victor's would always be stronger. Victor lifted his own hand, turning it, and like a puppet so did Stell, until his gun was resting against his own head. "It doesn't have to end like this," said Stell. "Twice you locked me in a cage," said Victor. "I don't intend to let it happen a third time." "And what will killing me do?" snapped Stell. "It won't stop the rise of Eon. The initiative is bigger than me, and growing every day." "I know," said Victor, guiding Stell's finger to the trigger. "God damn it, listen. If you kill me, you will make yourself Eon's #1 enemy, their primary target. They will never stop hunting you." Victor smiled grimly. "I know." He closed his hand into a fist. The gunshot split the room, and Victor's hand fell back to his side as Stell's body toppled to the floor. Victor took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then he pulled a slip of paper from his pocket, a page from the battered paperback, the lines blacked out except for 5 words. "Catch me if you can." Victor left the door open behind him. As he stepped out into the dark, he drew his phone from his pocket. It was buzzing again. Sydney's name, a streak of white against the black backdrop. Victor switched the phone off and let it slip from his fingers into the nearest trash can. And then he turned his collar up and walked away. Roman numeral 2. After. Outside Merritt. Sydney pressed the phone to her ear, listened as the ringing gave way to silence, the automated voicemail, the long beep. It was 15 minutes after midnight, and there was no sign of Victor. The car idled in the darkness just beyond the sign. Merritt, 23 miles. Mitch tense in the driver's seat, and Dahl leaning out the back window. Sydney paced the grassy shoulder and tried to call Victor one last time. It went straight to voicemail. Sydney hung up and found herself about to text June before she remembered that she no longer had her own phone, which meant that Sydney didn't have June's number anymore. And even if she did... Sid shoved the burner phone back in her pocket. She heard the car door open, Mitch's heavy steps in the grass as he approached. "Hey, kid," he said. His voice was so gentle, as if afraid of telling her the truth. But Sid already knew. Victor was gone. She stared at the distant skyline of Merritt, shoved her hands in her coat, felt her sister's bones in one pocket, the gun in the other.
"It's time to go,"
she said, returning to the car. Mitch turned on the engine, pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched ahead, flat and even and endless, almost like the surface of a frozen lake at night. Sidney resisted the urge to look back again. Victor might be gone, but there was still that thread tangling their lives. It had led Sidney to him once before, and it would lead her there again. No matter how long or far she had to look, sooner or later, she would find him. If Sidney had anything, it was time. Roman numeral 3. After. Eon. Holtz shivered, not at the sight of the corpse on the steel table, but from the cold. The storage room was fucking freezing.
Not so tough now,
muttered Briggs, her breath a cloud of fog. And it was true. Lying there, under the cold white light, Elliot Cardale looked young. All his age had been contained in those eyes, flat as a shark's. But now they were closed, and Cardale looked less like a serial-killing EO and more like Holtz's kid brother. Holtz had always wondered at the gap between body and corpse, the place where a person stopped being a he or a she or a they, and instead became an it. Elliot Cardale still looked like a person, despite the shockingly pale skin, the still glistening bullet wounds, small dark circles with serrated edges. Nobody knew how Haverty had been able to render Eli human, or at least mortal. Just like they didn't know who had shot the EO, or who had killed the ex-Eon scientist, though everyone seemed to assume it was Victor Vale.
Holtz,
snapped Briggs.
I'm freezing my ass off, and you're making moony eyes at a corpse.
Sorry, said Holtz, his breath pluming. Just thinking.
Well, stop thinking, she said, and help me load this thing.
Together they maneuvered Cardale's corpse into cold storage, which was basically just a permanent stretch of deep drawers in the basement of the Eon complex, dedicated to indefinitely housing the remains of deceased EOs.
One down,
she said, scribbling notes on her clipboard.
One to go.
Holtz's eyes flicked to the other body that waited, patiently, on its own steel plank. Rusher. Holtz had avoided looking at his old friend as long as possible, not just because of the gunshot wounds that stood out in livid marks against the old scars, but because he couldn't believe his eyes. Dominic had survived so much. They'd served together for 4 years and worked here, side by side, for another 3. And all that time, Holtz had never known what Rusher was. Rios was always telling them not to make assumptions, that EOs weren't ducks. They didn't have to walk like one and talk like one and smell like one to be one. But still, it's crazy, isn't it? He murmured. Makes you wonder how many are out there. And here, if I was an EO, you better believe this is the last place I'd be. Briggs wasn't listening. He couldn't blame her. Eon was in a state of emergency. They'd gotten the place back under lockdown pretty quickly, but they'd still lost 4 EOs in the process. A third of the soldiers were in medical. 5 had died. The Gala mission had been a total disaster. Eon's first unkillable EO was dead, possibly from the efforts of their own ex-employee, and the director hadn't even bothered to come to work today. Holtz needed a drink. Briggs sealed the doors to cold storage and they climbed back to the main levels. Holtz swiped through security and stepped outside, grateful that his shift was finally over. His car sat waiting on the employee side of the lot. It was a sleek yellow speedster, the kind that took on an animal grace. It didn't just drive. It prowled and growled and rumbled and purred, and the other Eon soldiers loved to give him shit for it. But Holtz hadn't craved many things since he'd gotten out of the army. Just fast cars and pretty girls, and he was only willing to pay for one of them. He climbed behind the wheel, engine revving pleasantly as he jacked up the heat, still trying to shake off the chill of cold storage, the lingering shock of the last 24 hours. As he pulled through the gate, Holtz cranked up the radio, trying to drown out the sound of the gravel drive. He shook his head. Eon, he assumed, could surely afford to have paved their private road, but apparently they didn't want to encourage any traffic. So if you were a civilian, hitting gravel in this area was a sign you'd gone the wrong way. Though some people didn't get the message, like this asshole, Holtz thought, looking down the road. A car had parked on the shoulder, a low black coupe, its taillights glaring and its hood raised. Holtz slowed, wondering if he should call it in, but then he saw the girl. She'd had her head bent over the engine, but as he drew up beside her car, she straightened, rubbing at her forehead. Blonde hair, red lips, tight-fitting jeans. Holtz rolled down the window. "This is private property," he said. "I'm afraid you can't stop here."
I didn't want to,
she said. The stupid thing just up and died. Holtz caught the edge of an accent. A melodic lilt. God, he loved accents. And of course, the girl went on, kicking a tire, I don't know shite about cars. Holtz eyed the low black beast. That's quite a car for someone who doesn't know shite. She smiled at that. A dazzling, dimpled smile. What can I say? She said in that musical voice. I have a weakness for nice things. She pulled her hair up off her neck. Think you can help? Holtz didn't know shit about cars either, but he wasn't about to admit it. He got out and rolled up his sleeves, approaching the engine. It reminded him of the fake bombs he'd had to defuse in basic training. He toggled and poked and made low humming sounds as the girl stood at his shoulder, smelling of summer and sunshine. And then miraculously, his fingers brushed over a hose, and Holtz realized it had simply come free. He reconnected it. Try starting it now, he said, and a second later, the coupe's engine rumbled to life. The girl let out a joyful sound. Holtz shut the hood, feeling triumphant. My hero, she said with mock sincerity, but genuine affection. She dug through her wallet. Here, let me pay you. You don't have to do that, he said. You bailed me out, she said. There has to be something I can do. Holtz hesitated. She was out of his league, but fuck it. You could let me buy you a drink. He braced himself for the inevitable rejection, wasn't surprised when the girl shook her head. No, she said. That won't do. But I'll buy you one. Holtz grinned like an idiot. He would have gone with her right then, left the black coupe on the side of the private road and driven her anywhere she wanted. But she apologized. She was running crazy late, thanks to the breakdown, and asked if he would take a rain check. Tomorrow night? He agreed. She held out her hand, palm up. Got a phone? He offered up his cell, flushing slightly when her fingers lingered on his, their touch feather-light, but electric. She added her name and number to his contacts and passed it back. Tomorrow, then, she asked, turning toward her car. Tomorrow, then. Holtz looked down at the entry in his phone. April? She glanced back at him through thick lashes and winked, and Holtz climbed into his yellow speedster and drove away, still watching April, haloed in the rearview mirror. He kept waiting for her to disappear, but she didn't. Life was strange and wonderful sometimes, and tomorrow he had a date. June watched the yellow car shrink into the distance. Idiot, she thought, starting up the road, this time on foot. By the time she reached the gates of Eon, she looked for all intents and purposes like Benjamin Holtz, observation and containment, age 27, loved his little brother and hated his stepdad, and still had nightmares about the things he'd seen overseas. What's this? Asked the security guard, rising from the booth. Stupid car broke down, she muttered, doing her best to imitate Holtz's northeastern accent. Ha, said the security guard. That's what you get for choosing style over substance. Yeah, said June. What you need is a good mid-level sedan. Just let me in so I can grab a van and some cables and get my shit back on the road. The gates parted, and June stepped through, easy as pie. She crossed the lot on foot and whistled at the sight of the front doors. It looked like someone had driven a car into them. Inside, a soldier looked up from some kind of scanning station. Back so soon? He asked, rising to his feet. Left my wallet somewhere. Won't get far without that. You're telling me. Small talk was an art form, one of those things that made people's eyes gloss over, go silent and they might start wondering why. But keep them talking about nothing at all and they won't even blink. You know the drill, said the soldier. June did not. This fell soundly in the realm of minutiae, something that rarely conveyed with a touch. Making a guess, she stepped into the scanner and waited. Come on, Holtz, said the soldier. Don't be a pain in my ass. Arms up. She rolled her eyes, but spread her arms. It was like standing inside a copier, a beam of white light that moved from head to toe, followed by a short chime. All clear, said the soldier. June saluted him, a casual flick of her fingers as she started down the hall. She needed to find a computer. It should have been easy, a building as fancy as this one, but every hallway looked alike. Identical, even. And every identical hallway was studded with even more identical doors, almost none of them marked. And the farther into the maze June went, the farther she'd have to walk out. So she settled instead for simplicity, pointing herself toward the nearest door. Halfway there it swung open. A female soldier stepped out, took one look at Holtz and rolled her eyes.
Forget something?
Always, said June. She didn't pick up her pace, but her fingers caught the door just before it closed. June slipped inside and found a small room with 4 computer consoles. Only one of them was occupied. Finally, the soldier said. I've had to piss for an hour. He started to swivel toward June, but she was already there, one arm hooking around his throat. She pinned him against the chair, cutting off his ability to speak, to shout for help. His back arched as he fought her hold, throwing punches made clumsy by shock and the sudden lack of oxygen. But Benjamin Holtz was no weakling, and June had killed her fair share of men. The soldier did manage to get a pen and jam it back into June's thigh. But of course, it wasn't her thigh. Sorry, Ben, she thought, tightening her hold. Soon enough, the soldier stopped fighting. He went limp, and she let go, rolling his chair out of the way so she could get to his computer. June hummed as her fingers slid over the keyboard. She had to hand it to Eon. They had a very user-friendly system, and half a minute later she'd found the file she needed. It had been labeled alias June. She skimmed through, curious to see what they'd found, which wasn't much, but still enough to merit the trip.
Goodbye,
she whispered, erasing the file and herself from the system. June went out the way she'd come in, retraced her steps down the hall, past security and the gates, back to the waiting black coupe. June opened the car door, and by the time she climbed behind the wheel, she was herself again. Not the leggy brunette, or the thin teen, or any of the dozen faces she'd recently worn, but a sprightly girl, with strawberry curls and a splash of freckles across her high cheeks. June let herself sit in that body for a moment, breathe with her own lungs, see with her own eyes, just to remember what it felt like. And then she reached out and started the engine, sliding into something safer, the kind of person you wouldn't look twice at, the kind who gets lost in the crowd. June glanced in the rearview mirror, checked her new face, and drove away. A message from Victor Vale, Roman numeral 1. Victor watched as his ability broke the current in his chest. A hand, fingers closing around a gun. The pain. A killing power. We hope you've enjoyed Vengeful, a Macmillan audio production from Tor Books. Recording and post-production by Listen Up Audiobooks. Text copyright 2018 by Victoria Schwab. Production copyright 2018 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.